Hello, and welcome to this special presentation from IOP ebooks. To celebrate Hugo van den Berg's latest book, Evolutionary Dynamics, The Mathematics of Genes and Traits, we are proud to present our specially commissioned video, Survival of the Fittest. We welcome your feedback and questions on the film. Please email us at ebooks@iop.org or tweet us at IOP Publishing with #MeetTheAuthor. We will endeavour to answer all questions submitted, and we will make them available to view on our website, ioppublishing.org. On that note, I shall let the video start.
Charles Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection to account for evolutionary change. Not everyone agreed with it, but then not everyone quite understood it either. His friend Alfred Wallace thought that much of the misunderstanding was due to Darwin's unfortunate choice of words. He wrote Darwin a letter in 1866 in which he suggested that natural selection invites confusion, whereas the phrase survival of the fittest would make everything perfectly clear. Nowadays, the word fitness conjures up the idea of supreme physical condition and athletic ability. Physical prowess provides perhaps the most intuitive example of an adaptive trait. A wonderful example is the cheetah, the ultimate predator, here seen chasing a Thompson's gazelle, the ultimate escapee. One can easily imagine the adaptive value in being able to chase a prey animal, as well as the value in being able to escape. Every ability comes at a cost. No organism can just stack advantageous traits, one on top of the other, without limit. If the prey weren't so quick, there would be less pressure to evolve cheetah speed. If the cheetah weren't so quick, there would be less advantage in being a fleet-footed gazelle. Each provides an ecological context to the other. Outside of this context, the evolutionary pressures to become so quick wouldn't exist. Swiftness would be traded off against something else. We can see that adaptive value is dependent on ecological context. Another example, a snake that preys on snails. Snails possess chirality, that is, handedness. A shell and its mirror image do not match up when you attempt to superimpose them. In fact, the snake's jaw has adapted to this handedness. One side of the jaw has more teeth than the other. No doubt this is an adaptive trait. That is, snakes with asymmetric jaws were favored as they were more efficient at catching and eating the snails. An example of fitness in the intuitive sense of the word, just being better at life. However, this adaptation on the part of the snake actually creates a definite adaptive advantage for mirror-reversed snails. These are almost safe from these lopsided snakes who struggle to catch and devour them. Is it difficult to flip? No, it just takes a single mutation. So why don't they? As it turns out, a snail struggles to mate with its enantioma, which is what a chemist would call a snail whose shell has the opposite handedness. So flipped mutants suffer a reproductive disadvantage, one that is not offset by the snake-deterring advantage, except when the ecological pressure exerted by the snakes is particularly high. Again, ecological context co-determines fitness. Now consider two populations of snails in two adjacent areas. In one area, the snake is extremely prevalent. In the other, it is absent. Where there are snakes, the flipped mutants enjoy a net advantage. They become more numerous in the course of subsequent generations. The mating disadvantage, which is density dependent, gradually dwindles. In the end, it is the original variant that faces a double whammy of being vulnerable and unable to find many mates of the same handedness. The flipped shell takes over in snake country. However, they can no longer mate with the original type snails from the adjacent area. A reproductive barrier has been raised. Why doesn't the snake counter-evolve? Well, perhaps it will, but it feeds on several species, and just one prey species flipping will not do it. But perhaps other snail species may also flip. Perhaps snakes and snails have been switching back and forth over the evolutionary past. Who knows? In any case, is it the fittest that survive? Every individual is dead in the long run, but what we are really talking about is differences in reproductive success that can be inherited by subsequent generations. Evolutionary theorists are sometimes told they are blinkered genetic determinists who believe that all there is to life is genes. That is unfair, but it is true that there is an emphasis on the genetically inheritable, and that stems entirely from the disparity in time scales. Individual lives barely register as blips on the evolutionary time scale. They flit by. Now this lady and gentleman are, in the vernacular of modern-day Britain, well fit. Recall the basic intuitive notion of fitness: generally being good at life, having the hardest teeth, the keenest eyes, the sharpest ears, the swiftest reflexes. These are adaptive traits. Preferring mates that exhibit these traits is also adaptive. In fact, it is enough to just share a preference with the majority of one's own sex, even if it is for a false sign of being good at life. For your offspring of the opposite sex will inherit that outward appearance, and your same-sex offspring will just enjoy the same advantage as you did. It all sounds a bit circular, but it does check out. The question remaining is how the majority preference for a false sign establishes itself in the first place. Stotting in Thomson's gazelles seems to be a signal to both predators and to potential mates. It may seem risky to betray your location to cheetahs in the vicinity, but at least they can see how good at jumping you are and therefore how likely to get away. At the same time, you are signaling true to potential mates. The peacock's tail is a well-known example of prominent display. Bright colors are biochemically expensive and thus attest to food-gathering ability. Dragging around a bunch of back feathers that potentially make you more vulnerable to predators may also be construed as a sign that you are so awesome at life you can even hack it with a big, useless appendage. Or perhaps the mere selective advantage of just wanting what all the other girls want, no matter what it is, selected for ever more outrageous plumage in the male. Of course, none of this is implying that conscious thought or calculation is involved on the part of the peahens, although it does take a modicum of neural circuitry to recognize the preferred type. The story of the snail can be seen as a story of a single locus, a story of the gene that governs the handedness of the shell. Some variants of the gene at that locus are more numerous in the next generation, some less so. There is stochastic variation imposed on the underlying systematic effect, and in small populations, this stochasticity may completely skew the outcome. This tells us that in general we should be looking at expectations over an ensemble of parallel evolutionary histories, which is no problem from a mathematical point of view, but an empirical embarrassment, because we have only one planet to look at. However, on a more modest scale we can achieve experimental duplication. A key point is that by considering the tendency to be represented at higher or lower numbers in subsequent generations, we can assign fitness values to the gene variants at that locus. Naturally, a single locus does not achieve reproductive success all by itself. It works together with all the other genes to create the life history of that organism. What we are measuring is the difference that the difference at that locus makes, averaged over the genetic contexts in which it finds itself. It is individuals that have offspring, and if fitness is to do with differential reproductive success, we may well suppose that the individual is the appropriate entity to focus on. Not so. This ichthyosaur was buried in mud just as she was giving birth, and she and her calf have been fossilized. Perhaps she had calves before this one. If so, her descendantship might have encompassed the entire population some generation down the line, or perhaps none of it. These are in fact the only two possibilities in the long run in a finite population. But do we really care about the long-term reproductive success of this particular individual, or any one individual for that matter? In the long term, individual reproductive success is all or none, but should fitness be a binary number? Trying to construct a fitness concept around the reproductive success of the individual leads to all sorts of problems, such as parental care, altruistic behavior, and so on. These can all be sorted out within the framework of individual fitness, and W.D. Hamilton has shown us how, but the technical details can be a bit daunting. In bacteria, reproduction and expansion are pretty much the same thing. They absorb matter and energy from their environment and turn it into biomass. A bacterium seems to be seeking, as Bertrand Russell put it, to transform as much as possible of its environment into itself. How well the organism succeeds in doing this is expressed by the relative growth rate, which has been used in microbiology as a direct measure of fitness. It could be objected that this only makes sense in exponentially growing populations. Natural selection also happens, of course, in populations that are stationary or even shrinking. It is changes in relative preponderance that matter in evolution. Now, there are ecological circumstances under which the relative growth rate at the present moment in time does not predict evolutionary prospects in the long run. If we accommodate these caveats, the result is this definition used in adaptive dynamics. Optimization of this quantity is not generally the same thing as optimizing the relative growth rate outright. To calculate the correct fitness value, the relevant biology, ecology, genetics, life history, physiology, has to be taken into account, and this has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But then it could hardly be otherwise, considering the importance of context. All these technicalities seem to be leading us ever further away from the simple insight that underpins Darwin's theory of natural selection. Boiled down to its essence, this is the idea. There is a population of organisms, here imagined as simple creatures that sit on the seafloor and release spores. A mutant arises that can take better advantage of the ecological opportunities and produce more spores. In subsequent generations, the mutant becomes more preponderant. At last, the original wild type has disappeared. What was once the mutant has now become the wild type. Such a takeover event can be regarded as the elementary building block of evolutionary dynamics. Plotting the fraction of the population that is mutant as a function of time, we generically expect to see a sigmoid curve. In observing these systems, we are constrained by certain limitations imposed by the need to monitor the process over a large number of generations, and the need for replicates of the ecosystem in which the process takes place. This is rather a tall order. However, mammals infected with a persistent virus do provide a system of study in which we can follow the process over many generations and have some level of replication, although without complete control. Here we have an observed takeover event. A particular mutant strain of the virus, initially a tiny fraction of the viral load, becomes the dominant strain within a couple of months. The selective pressure is provided by the patient's immune system. What is favored is, essentially, any mutant whose proteins are poorly recognized by the immune system. The correct definition from adaptive dynamics is really talking about the initial part of the sigmoid takeover curve, where the increase of the mutant fraction is almost exponential. The definition effectively asks us to imagine an environment in which the mutant remains infinitely rare in perpetuity. This idea is related to the notion of a heat bath in statistical physics. Although formally correct, this is hardly a practical recipe for putting a numerical value to the fitness. What can be done, however, is to fit a logistic equation to the data. The fitness is then obtained as one of the estimated parameters. The problem with this fix is that the process may not satisfy the conditions under which that logistic equation is an accurate description of the takeover curve. However, this can be remedied by fitting a kind of local logistic. Let's consider a population of water fleas. We are just considering the females. Each has many broods, but life is hard. Only a few daughters become breeding individuals themselves. We connect each female to her reproductively active daughters in the next generation. We repeat this for many generations. At some point, everyone will have descended from just one female in the generation we started with. We call her Eve. This is true even when, as in the simulation shown, all females have the same average fecundity, which simply means that fitness effects are absent, and that each female in the generation we started with has an equal chance of becoming Eve. So, if we rerun the simulation many times over, we will see in each run that one of the 30 turns out to have been Eve, the other 29 having zero eventual descendantship. However, all are equally likely to become Eve. In expectation, their descendantship is 1 over 30. If there are selective effects on top of this stochastic variation, the expected descendantship of the fitter individual will look like a sigmoid takeover curve. Plotting the expected descendantship against its relative rate of change, we obtain a straight line if the curve happens to be logistic. If not, a Legendre transform will find the local R value. This construction gives us the individual fitness, so we can have that if we want to, but most of the time the sort of questions in which we are interested in evolution are really questions about types. This is because it is biological characteristics that survive in the long run, not individuals, populations, or species. All we need to do is keep track of the individuals that belong to that type and monitor their expected descendantship in the same way. That gives us the fitness for that type relative to that starting generation, and looking prospectively from that generation over the ensemble of possible futures emanating from that generation. The class can be defined however we like, in terms of a phenotypical characteristic or a genetic characteristic. The distinction between phenotype and genotype is traditional, but in fact the line is blurred. The advantage of the present approach is that it does not really matter, since you can define your type class any way you like. Each type definition comes with its own fitness value. We can use any number of type definitions to obtain any number of corresponding fitness values, thus probing the evolutionary dynamics of the system at hand.
We hope you enjoyed Survival of the Fittest and found it of interest. Please feel free to share this with your friends and colleagues. Evolutionary Dynamics, the Mathematics of Genes and Traits is available now. Visit iopscience.org/books for more information. And don't forget to rate this video using the ratings button at the top of the presentation screen. Thank you and goodbye.